which is that we are building off of some of the stuff that we've seen in previous weeks about Amira Lagoy, the labor of non-Jews on Shabbos, how we relate to that. I'm not going to dive like super deeply into some of the conceptual framing, because I think especially in both Aaron and Alan's share and some of the ones that we've been having about the role of speech in general, we've talked a bit about how do we relate to non-Jews doing labor on Shabbos, what does this say about Shabbos, etc. But we have some fun, very tactless stuff to get into today. So I think so that I can see people, I'm gonna not share screen if that's okay, but I can reshare the link to the source sheet in here if anyone needs. Because we will be looking at a good number of things in here. I think we're gonna go through Stefan Seif Dalid. We're gonna spend the largest chunk of our time on Seif Hay, which is the question of Amir Alagoy for the purpose of a mitzvah / for some other tzorech, looking into how we end up with these pretty diverging stocks, and a little bit at the end. Okay. Seif Dalid. Right? What is the topic? Anybody? Rev Joel or Max?
Can you give money to a non-Jew before Shabbos that'll be used to purchase things potentially on Shabbos, or maybe definitely on Shabbos?
I need a non-Jew to buy something for me. I give them money with the intent of them buying something for me. Can I give them money before Shabbos, as long as I'm not saying, because everyone agrees I can't give them money and say, buy something for me on Shabbos. And in fact, everyone ends up agreeing that I also can't give them money and then say, I need this bought. By the way, I need it. Like, it's 10 minutes before Shabbos starts, and say, by the way, I need this Motzei Shabbos. What's another case that's similar to that? What's another one which, if you give it to them, it's considered equivalent to having asked them to do it on Shabbos? Max?
Laundry, giving clothes.
The laundry, that is a particular instance. It's true that it depends partially on assumptions about when people need it, but there's also things about environmental norms and norms of like when things are being sold.
So if the only time the shuk is open is on Shabbat, you can't tell them, I need this thing, when the only time they could conceivably get it is on Shabbat.
Exactly. That if it's a scenario in which the only time they would be able to get the thing, the only time that item, I didn't tell them to get it on Shabbos, it's just that the only day they could ever buy it is on Shabbos, it's considered equivalent to having it. Okay. All of these, I think we'll look briefly at the Beit Yosef in this. We'll read the Shulchan Aruch Psak, and then I think there's an interesting little back and forth between sort of how the Taz paskins versus how the Mechaber and the Aruch HaShulchan paskin on benefiting from this labor. So let's look at the Beit Yosef. So we're in Shin Zayin, right? Also the numbering I put in here. I know there's the numbering in the Shirat Dvorah does not always accord with Al HaTorah. So I do not know what the Al HaTorah numbering for this particular one is. If anybody does, feel free to consult. These are Gimel and Daled in the Shirat Dvorah. So does anybody, actually, I'm just going to call on people to read because that's usually more efficient. Jacob, would you like to read Gimel in the Beit Yosef?
Sure. Katuv b'piskei harash b'parak hasilcher et po'olim b'shem Rav Sadia she'asor lomar lagoy me'erev Shabbat hichmot v'kana li kach v'kach v'Shabbat. So it's written in Piskei Harash and Parak Hasilcher Polim. And you have Rav Sadia that's asur to say to a goy in erev Shabbat to bring money and acquire for me this and this on Shabbat.
Or Halach Ma'ot, fun little throwback to last year, language of Halach, as like here's money.
Oh,
Here
okay.
it is. Go get something for me on Shabbos. Okay,
Yes.
continue.
וחטפו רבינו ירוחם בחלק י"ב, וזה לשונו. הגת מרדכי בפרק כמה דשבת, מכאן אסר רבי שמעון בן רבי ברוך
Yeah.
ליתן לגוי מות מערב שבת, לקנות לו בשבת. אבל יכול לומר לו קנה לעצמי, ואם יצטרך אקנם עמך נלך לאחר שבת. כדאש לכן לגבי חמץ ישראל, וגוי שהיו באים בספינה.
Okay, so just, you don't have to do word for word, but summarize.
So it's saying that it's usher to give money to a goy for them to buy for you, but you can give it for them to buy for themselves, and then if you happen to need after Shabbat, you can buy from them. And it's similar to what we see with someone who, I guess, needs to sell his chlamets to a goy for Pesach, and they're on a boat.
Right, I mean, he's comparing it to Mecheret Chametz, of like, the sense of like, yeah, you're buying my chametz. Like, if it just so happens that I buy it back from you after Pesach, so be it. But that like, you're buying my chametz from me for Pesach. So similarly, in this case, it seems that you're actually not necessarily, I think you're not necessarily giving the goy money before Shabbos. It's that you tell them, hey, you know, like, you could buy for, I personally really want a coffee grinder, and for some reason I need a non-Jew to get that for me. We tell them, you know, if you got a coffee grinder, I might buy it from you after Shabbos. Right? Like, I don't give them the money and say, hey, I need a coffee grinder. But if you were to get one, I would maybe buy it from you when it's no longer Shabbat. That is considered to be okay. And now we have to contrast this with something that we see elsewhere in Hilchot Shabbos. Lo damu. This is after the parentheses Sham, but lo damu l'chol hanhu.
Okay. Lo damu l'chol hanhu disar beit Hillel im hashemesh dichulhu ibay avid machar ibay yamtin nimsa degoy adat nafshe ka'avid aval hacha efshar im machar b'yom hashuk ad kan l'shonel. And it's not similar to everything that, like, I guess around like Bena Shmasho, Beit Hillel permitted you to do.
Right. So Beit Hillel, this is part of, there's the larger dispute between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai about whether you can start processes that will continue over Shabbos, right? Beit Hillel thinks that like something where the process itself is not one that you could do on Shabbos. Can you like get it going before Shabbos, knowing it won't be finished before? But also says you can like give these things to a tanner or these things to a launderer or whatever, like before Shabbos, even if there is not time for them to have done the labor with it prior to Shabbat. And so he's saying, what's the difference between there, where you're allowed to give these skins to a tanner right before Shabbos, and here?
It's it's the fact that the goy is doing that work of tanning or whatever on Shabbat specifically out of his own volition. He could do it another day, but for himself, he wants to do it on Shabbat.
Right. That in this case, you're giving them the skins, like, you're not saying, I need these motzach, presumably in the case of the Beit Hillel scenario. So we know that they might work them on Shabbos, but you're not telling them to do it. They don't need to do it then. And so if they do it then, that was like of their own volition, right? So the Beit Yosef in this final line says that the Yom HaShuk thing, it seems to be sort of lav dafka. It's just that also, yes, if it's the only day they could buy, that's a problem. Also, certainly if you explicitly told them, buy something for me on Shabbos, that is a problem, right? That the cases that Beit Hillel mentions where it's fine, it's because you gave them a thing before Shabbos, knowing they could work it then, but you didn't, sorry, you didn't ask for it immediately after Shabbos. And so it is possible that they will not work it then, right? You're not definitionally asking for them to do that labor on Shabbat.
Yes.
Okay. So we're not going to, I think, read it Daled fully inside. The main thing that's going to come out of this that we'll see in the Shulchan Aruch is a notion from the Smach. What notion does the Smach introduce that gives us some leeway, a bit more of a heter?
The idea of fixing a price.
Exactly, right? This idea of giving them a particular fee, like a money for doing a general labor. That this is, to be clear, about giving them things to sell, and that if you pay them money for their labor in advance, then it's not considered as if they're just doing this sort of for you on Shabbat. So this is what we'll see now if folks want to flip to Shulchan Aruch. You may see the psak inside. Jess, do you want to read Sif Daled in the Shulchan Aruch?
Sure. מותר לתת לעקום מעות מערב שבת כקנות לו, ובלבד שלא יום קנה בשבת. לעומת וכן מותר ליתן לו בגדים למכור, ובלבד שלא יאמר לו למכרן בשבת. מי ששכר עקום להוליך אותו, ובא העקום וקחה מבית ישראל בשבת, אסור וראוי לאנוש.
Okay. So again, doesn't need to be word for word, but what are the main takeaways from this?
So the main takeaway is that it's totally fine to give someone money on Erev Shabbat, so long as you're not explicitly telling them to buy something on Shabbat. And same thing with laundry and all these other cases. The important thing is not just, it has to be
laundry.
not.
What's the note?
No, sorry, clothes to sell. The important thing is not to explicitly say to sell them on Shabbat.
Right. And then not only that you're not supposed to tell them to do things on Shabbos, but now we also say they shouldn't be coming to collect that stuff from you on Shabbos either. Right. And it's interesting, this language of ra'ui le'enosh ha'oseh, right, sort of implies that potentially this is something that's occurring that they feel the need to address, and that like it's a bit of a weird status, right, where it's not that you have explicitly told the non-Jew to do that. Seemingly it's a scenario where like you have a business relationship, they show up to you on Shabbos being like, hey, do you have the goods? I can take them. And nonetheless, we're saying like, even though you're not giving them money, right, you're technically not, like, you yourself aren't doing like a monetary exchange in that moment. It's like, it's usher for you to be giving them these goods on Shabbos they're then about to go and sell, right? And it seems, I think the language of the noshals, which is not something that we see so commonly, implies like, in some ways, potentially less of a strong isser, but one that we're therefore sort of more worried about people violating.
Yeah, I was kind of curious about that. Like, were people going around getting a knas for breaking Shabbos for tzedakah, right? To break Shabbos, whatever.
Yeah.
The reality is there.
No, I'm assuming yes, because it seems like it's responding to, I think especially the Re'uila and Noshalza, to me implies that like this is a scenario that has come up. But does anyone else have burning thoughts on this before we go into our other little Shulchan Aruch bit? Or Joel?
Well, I just the Magen Avraham there is kind of interesting in terms of like where it's in Sif Katan Vav, where he talks about he quotes his Rabbeinu, I don't know who it is, Sasson, that if you make that we trust people to say I did this b'shogeg, and then we don't punish them, right? Which I think there is this whole thing that people just don't know, right? They think what they're doing is perfectly fine. And, you know, they don't understand this is Asur on Shabbos. So he's like, those people we don't punish. Although maybe that the Ramah may have actually meant those people. Yeah, it's like, you know, that we have to kind of get the lesson out there. So.
Yeah, and they end up saying, like, also adding that even, right, that like even if you've like set it aside, right, it's not even that you're like handing the goods over to him, but he knows that you have your little storage room and your business partner is coming to pick it up. You're still not supposed to allow that to happen on Shabbos because they're still sort of like in your possession. He's coming and taking these things that were yours on Shabbos to go sell them. It's considered unideal.
What
Okay.
about the reverse? What about the reverse? If you gave it to him before Shabbat and he delivers it on Shabbat, I mean,
Delivers it to who?
you to the Jew on Shabbat, like for the laundry, let's say.
Look at the
Oh.
bottom of the
Olad?
again on there, right? At the very end, he says, "Umihu imakum lekacha mi Beit Yisrael kodem hashabat alpha bishim maflig b'Shabbat share." Right. So really, the
Right.
distinction.
There, I think it's dealing with benefiting because in this scenario, it seems to be dealing more with selling merchandise rather than laundering sort of thing. The laundering, we'll get into what we're about to see in a second. But there, I think the notion of like, if he took it from before, sorry, Rachel, what were you about to say?
But I don't know. It's hard to tell. Is he modifying the yichedlo makom, or is he modifying the whole thing at that point? I'm not sure. So
I was reading as the whole thing.
Okay.
But I think you can read it either way. But the question that you just raised, Rav Nachum, is sort of even, and this is what's going to come up in the Taz, even if you did everything right, quote unquote, right? You didn't do any of the things we told you not to do. Are you able to benefit from these things if they are nonetheless done on Shabbos or no? Right. But
I'm thinking about an Amazon delivery.
Well, that has several factors that we can get into. But first, we're going to look at this Shulchan Aruch. So if you see in the doc, the Shulchan Aruch and Reish Mem Hey is mostly what we just saw in the Smak before, that you can give Shlora to an Akum to sell if you have given them like a wage, as long as you don't explicitly say sell it on Shabbos. And then in Reish Nun Bet, Isaac, do you want to read?
Sure. So Shin Bet.
Reish Nun Bet, Seif Daled.
Oh,
This
you
is
know
on
what?
the
I'm in the wrong
document.
book. Hang on just a sec.
Lexie, I'm happy to read if it's fast.
Yeah, maybe.
Sorry, right?
Yeah, it's on the source sheet. Isaac, I think Aaron can read this, and then I'll have you read the next thing since we have it up in front. So Rishon and Bet.
כל שקצץ, אף על פי שיעשה העכו"ם מלאכה בשבת. מותר לישראל ללבוש הכלי בשבת עצמה. דכל שקצץ, עדה דנפשי כעבד. So if you gave someone a certain amount of money and said, you know, have this ready whenever, and they happen to do it on Shabbat, you can even wear those clothes on Shabbat, since as long whenever you apportion out payment without a time scale, the person is doing it on their own volition. They're choosing to do it on Shabbat, and you're not making them.
Exactly. But the Ramah is going to bring V'yesh Osrin.
Yesh Osrin l'lavsha kol sheyadua she'akum gmaro b'Shabbat. Right, and so some people say you can't do it if you know that the akum actually finished washing the garment on Shabbos or laundering the garment. V'tzarich lahamtim v'motzei Shabbos kadei sheyaseh. Right. So some people say you should wait Kadesh Yasu, and that's ideally what we should do. Unless you really, really need it on Shabbos. And if there's a possibility of if you think it's possible and you don't know that he finished it on Friday, then lechatchila it's fine to wear. Even according to the issues.
Exactly. But we have the idea of the Ish Osrin say, in general, if we know that it was done on Shabbos, then you should wait to use it until the amount of time that labor would have taken after Shabbat. But everyone would agree that if you can like they theoretically had the possibility to have done it before Shabbos, even if the likelihood of that is slim, you're allowed to benefit. Okay. The Taz, however, does not agree with this. I think what we're actually going to do is we're going to read the Aruch HaShulchan because he summarizes the Taz and then briefly responds. So Isaac, do you have the Google Doc with the sources?
Yes, I do. Sorry.
No worries. So we're looking at the Aruch HaShulchan under Seif Daled.
Okay. וכתב התז, סעיף קטן ג' אפילו מאי דמוטל עם השמש כמו ליתן לכובס וכיוצא בזה, אין לומר לו ראה שאני צריך לכם במוצאי שבת, דזהו כאומר לו לעשות בשבת. Okay, so Taz says that even if it's something permissible, like giving someone things like dishes that need to be washed, you don't say to him, I'm going to need this right on Motzei Shabbos, because that's like you're telling them you have to do it on Shabbat, because otherwise how will you have the time? It's like we said.
Exactly. One just quick note, kalim in this case is clothes, right? Kalim
Okay.
is so kalim lekobes to the launderer. But yeah, that's saying I need them Motzei Shabbos is like saying do it on Shabbos.
וכן אם נתן לו מעות לקנות דבר בערב שבת, סמוך לערב, ואין לו מה הנני נוסע... Pardon me?
ואמר לי.
ואמר לי, הנני נוסע לדרכי במוצאי שבת, אסור, זהו כאמור לו קנה בשבת. So also you don't give someone money on Erev Shabbat right before Shkia and say, oh, I'm going to need something right after Shabbos because I'm traveling, because that's the same thing as saying go shopping on Shabbos. וכן במה שנתבאר דמותר אם לא ייחוד לו לקנותו בשבת, וגם אין יום השוק בשבת, וגם לא אמר לי, הנני נוסע במוצאי שבת דמותר, בחי גבנה, מכל מקום אם קנה בשבת לא יהנה הישראל מזה באותו שבת, וזהו כמו שאינו יהודי שעשה מלאכה בשביל הישראל דאסור להשתמש בו, עיין שם ולא ידעתי...
Pause there. The Ayin Sham is where the end of the Taz is.
Okay. And so, let's see, we went to don't tell people to buy stuff on Shabbos implicitly. And for things that it's been explained that it's permissible if it's not done like specifically for him to buy it on Shabbat, like and there's like market day is not on Shabbat, and you don't say, because market day is not on Shabbat, and you don't say to him like I'm traveling Motzei Shabbos. So if it's really a situation where it's like you could buy it whenever, you don't specifically have to do it on Shabbos, then it's okay. If he bought it on Shabbat, but you can't get hana'ah from the item on that Shabbat itself. And
because this is just like in general when we say you can't benefit from labor a non-Jew does for you on Shabbos, right? If they do it explicitly for you, then you have to wait this bichtei shi'asu, and the time it would take so that you're like not benefiting from that having been on Shabbos, you have to wait the amount of time it would take to do after Shabbat. So the Taz says, even if you don't do any of the things we just mentioned, right? You have done everything correctly, like you have given them money or given them things to sell in a way that doesn't explicitly require them to do it on Shabbos, right? So you have acted in a way that is mutter. Nonetheless, if they do end up doing it on Shabbos and they give it to you, he still says that you can't benefit from it. He's like, you were allowed to give it to them in the way that you did, but nonetheless, you are not allowed to benefit from it now that that has been done on Shabbos, right?
Right.
So this is that's the Taz's take. And then we have the Aruch HaShulchan coming in with his own thoughts, below Yadati.
לא ידעתי הדמיון דהתם נעשה מלאכה בשבילו, אבל ככה נעשה רק מקח וממכר בשבילו, ובעצם הדבר לא נעשה מלאכה. Okay, I don't really get the analogy because in that case, he did malacha for him, like in the washing, but here he's just doing regular commerce for him. And so there's not, like at the root of it, there's no malacha.
Right. That the Aruch HaShulchan says there's a difference between like a non-Jew cooking something for you, right? Or like making, like it's only existent because they did a malacha for you, versus like this thing was already, this mecher already existed before Shabbos. He just did a durabanan iser of like mekach umemkar to acquire it, right? But like this object already existed on Shabbos, and there's no malacha that was necessarily involved, either in it arriving at your doorstep or in sort of the creation of this and its like ability to be used, right? And so the Aruch HaShulchan says, no, like you could very consistently hold that I'm not allowed to benefit from the malacha of a non-Jew on Shabbos, and nonetheless, if he ended up buying me something on Shabbat that I can use on Shabbos, as long as I didn't tell him to do it, then I can use it on Shabbos. Or Vlandis, it looked like you wanted to say something. No?
Yeah. I've thought a couple of times now, this is actually sort of the reverse of the intuition that many of us would have today, right? Because like commerce is actually the like in our economy, the foundation of like earning stuff or like doing work. And actually like for many of us, like physical labor might actually be like less associated with like accomplishing something substantive.
Right. I think we talked about this a little bit also when it comes to the various language around the Isurim around language, as well as the Isurim around like business and stuff that we see arising in like Ezra and Nehemiah, for example, where we see a bit of a transition to a more urban society, and a bit of a shift in what their economies look like, where, yeah, if like your paradigm for the initial malachot is a society where it's primarily agrarian, then this is the labor people are doing. And it's true that there has been like a bit of a disconnect in a world where like the primary thing you associate with work is sort of business, but that ultimately that's not considered to be the paradigmatic, most problematic form of labor, which I think when we're thinking about creative labor as part of it, and also the connection sort of theologically to the notion of affecting the world around you, there is something to be said about the difference between acquiring something that already existed versus making something existent or functional. But yeah, it's not always an intuitive distinction. Ori?
I was going to say that the Aruch HaShulchan's sort of pushing back on that idea that the Sur has progressed or evolved to our modern times, that really, specifically for what you can benefit from on Shabbat, we're talking about things that are created or in some way on Shabbat, the way you explained it, I think. So that's, you know, that makes a lot of sense. So even if business is something that we shun, you know, for different reasons, it's not the creative, like you said, it's not the creative thing. And then the thing that's Asur and Shabbat, the thing that could have Isur Malacha, you know, an Isur attached to it, would have to be created in some way, it sounds like, and not, you know, you can't say the deal was created or the kinyan was created for the Aruch HaShulchan.
Yeah. I see somebody else with a hand.
Joel was also trying to.
Hey, Reb Nachum was before me, and so was Aaron, though. So.
All right, Aaron, then Reb Nachum.
I don't know that it's just about questions of created, because the question of if this person buys a thing for me, and they do it in a way that's okay, the fact that that thing was created on Shabbos is not important for whether I can use it. Meaning if I if I give them money and say buy this at some point, they happen to buy it on Shabbos. And not only do they buy it on Shabbos, but the thing they buy was actually made on Shabbos. I don't think the fact that it was made on Shabbos is material for the question of whether I can use it. But I'm not actually.
It's true that like in the case where I tell them to buy something for me on Shabbos, the reason everyone would agree that I'm not supposed to benefit from the thing if I told them to buy me something on Shabbat and they brought it to me. Everyone agrees that I'm not allowed to benefit from that, and they frame it as a knas, right? That like you weren't supposed to do that, right? And so you're not allowed to benefit from it. But the thing that we're seeing here with Aruch HaShulchan is if it's a scenario of them buying something for you, not of them having done malacha for you. And in that case, and you did it in a mutter way, right? You didn't tell them to do it for you on Shabbos. They didn't need to do it. They just so happened to do it at this time. Then the knas framework isn't relevant. And then our question is like sort of in the ikar of the thing, is there a problem with benefiting from the sort of labor that they've done? And the answer that Aruch HaShulchan gives is that no, labor that sort of is business-like, that doesn't sort of change the material reality of what you're dealing with, is not as problematic as creative labor, which we also see this heter come up when it comes to, for example, things that have been brought in from either that have been carried or brought in from outside of the tchum. Sometimes that is like a leniency that people will apply of like, oh yeah, okay, if somebody brought something to my Shabbos meal that they like cooked on Shabbos, I can't eat it. But if they brought something from outside of the Eruv, and there's those who say, well, the thing was already ready, right? Like the fact that it was carried didn't actually change the goof of the object, right? And so there are many who are lenient to say, in that case, you can in fact benefit from the thing. So I think that's another way we just see the distinction between how it impacts the physicality of the thing versus like whether an Isser has been done or something that is not allowed on Shabbos has been done.
But to Aaron's point, it's only a problem even in the Aruch HaShulchan because it wasn't na'aseh bishvilo. Like you could sort of stake the essence of what he's saying here on the bishvilo instead of on the na'aseh. You see what I mean? That distance is created from who it was made. It wasn't made for him. Only the business was done for him. So it has to be two things. It's not. To
Well,
Aaron's
right, but we
point,
also don't know
everything
that we're
created on
dealing.
Shabbat is usher, just the things made for you, right?
Correct.
If
I
they're
mean,
made
it's
for
also,
someone
we
else.
don't know that this was made on Shabbos. And depending on what kind of schora we're dealing with, it very likely could be something that was made before Shabbos. But it's also true that if it's a schora that was made on Shabbos, but it was just like a merchant making their wares to be sold, that wasn't made for you, a Jew. So then the only relevance is the purchasing. Rav Nachum, your thing? You're on mute.
Thank you. My finger is not unmuting it. Thank you. Yeah, it seems to me that there is a sort of a oxymoron, not oxymoron, a contradiction here, something bizarre going on, and I'd like to offer an answer. What's weird is going on is that Hillel is saying you can give these things, you can start these things going before Shabbat, even though the malacha will happen on Shabbat, and that we're saying is mutter to benefit from. Well, although actually I wonder about that. I wonder if he means to say you can benefit from it after Shabbat, not on Shabbat.
Well,
I'm not sure.
That becomes a bit of a debate, but also there's a distinction between some of the things that Beit Hillel is mentioning, which is you setting in motion a process that just continues, like sort of, again, continuously throughout Shabbos, versus also like you giving something to a non-Jew who then might do that work.
So what I think is a little bit weird, or is it contradictory, is that why would it be that if you asked a goy to do something that's not even a malacha, that would be worse? Where here it's an actual malacha. And I think the answer is that, I mean, why would the Taz say that? Why would he say it's worse when you give it to him and and like the Aruch HaShulchan says, it's only the Rabbanan? I think the key point that the Taz is trying to say is that is this idea of what he says about Yom HaShuk, that when you give it to him, and Saturday is the only day when you can buy these things, or the most 90% likely or 95% likely, or he also said, or like if you give it to him right before Shabbat, and you say I want it Motzei Shabbat, then he's saying you haven't really succeeded in saying to him, I don't mind if you do this before Shabbat, because you haven't given him, because you've basically implied to him, do it on Shabbat. And that's why he wants to give you a kanas. But if you would give him enough time, or if every day would be Yom HaShuk, then he wasn't saying his din about that. And
No, the Taz was very explicit. He says this din is about even when you did it in the correct way and you didn't like tell them or imply to them that it should be done on Shabbos. Even then, he still thinks that if it ends up being bought on Shabbos, you shouldn't be able to benefit from it, right? And that's part of the Aruch HaShulchan's issue. Is he's like, yeah, there's no knas applicable here because you acted correctly. You didn't either tell or imply to them they need to do it on Shabbos. And again, that the issue of malacha is not applicable. I also
but he
think
says this whole thing, Havale kemazkir yom Shabbat. He says, it's as though because you gave it to him, if the Yom HaShuk is Shabbat.
Yeah, that's when he's talking about the things you're not allowed to do, right? And then he said, "V'chein b'ma shenitzba'er demutar im lo yeched lo liknot b'Shabbat v'gam ein Yom HaShuk b'Shabbat v'gam lo amar le da." Even if you didn't do any of those things, nonetheless, im kana b'Shabbat lo yana Yisrael mizeh be'oto Shabbat. Right? The Taz ends up saying, even if you did it in the totally correct way, you still can't benefit from the thing on Shabbat. I do think that's also different than the Beit Hillel processes of malacha that are set in place, because part of it is that like a thing that is considered malacha, if you were to be doing it, is being done. But kind of the whole point, amongst other things, is that there is no human labor happening in those cases that Beit Hillel says is okay. We refer to this as the dispute about like shvitat kelim, right? What does it mean to like try and create an environment where there's like not labor or production being done? But minimally, you can see Beit Hillel as elevating this element of like, we're trying not to involve human labor on Shabbos. And so you starting a process that if you were to actively do it on Shabbos would be a problem, but just letting it go, letting the machines do their thing in a way that doesn't involve actively petitioning any person to do a thing is different than trying to get even a non-Jew to actively act on your behalf on Shabbos. Last thing, Rav Joel, brief comment, and then we will press onwards because there is a lot to learn about asking non-Jews to do things for mitzvahs.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of go through the categories because the Ramah, right, and what was it, Rish Mem Hey, right? He seems to be like, if you did everything right, you can benefit on Shabbos, no doubt about it, right? Like it was either Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah says maybe, right? If you can be lot that he didn't do it, but so the Shulchan Aruch says, Mechaber says you can do it. You can benefit from it as long as you did everything right, right? You katzatz lo damim, whatever it may be. The Ramah says, well, as long as you can rely on it. The Taz seems to be saying no, right? You can't. If it was done on Shabbos, you can't benefit from it, no matter how good a job you did. And the Aruch HaShulchan is like splitting the difference in some ways, where he's like, you can do it for things that are about transferring objects, but not about changing objects, right? That seems to be the Aruch HaShulchan's take on it, right? So you have the Mechaber, like you can benefit from something that was done on Shabbos as long as you weren't the reason, you weren't specific, you wanted it done on Shabbos. The Ramah's like, well, maybe in some cases, if you could maybe say maybe it wasn't done on Shabbos. The Taz says absolutely not, and the Aruch HaShulchan says only for things where it was transferred, but not when it was changed as an object. Did I get that right? I just want to make sure the summary goes.
I think that's correct. I think that's an accurate portrayal of our different sheets. Okay. We press on. We're moving to Sif Hey, which is the biggest bulk of our learning today, which is about asking non-Jews to do things for the purpose of a mitzvah and or maybe for some other significant purpose. So for the sake of time, I think I'm going to read our Gemara in Eruvin, right? So this picks up on Eruvin near the bottom of Eruvin, Samech Zayin Amud Bet, with Hahu Yanoka. So it says, Hahu Yanoka di ish bi chamime, right? There's a baby whose hot waters were spilled, right? And Rashi explains, right, this is a baby, shayu rotzin l'mol'o ve'chamulo chamin be'erev v'nishpachu hayom, right? This is a baby who it's the 8th day, right? It's the time for their Mila is on Shabbos. And in general, you're allowed to do Mila itself, which involves, Isurim on Shabbat. It is Doche Shabbat. But you're not supposed to, the normative opinion that ends up being followed is that you're not supposed to do other things besides the Mila itself that are usur in order for it to happen on Shabbos, right? So they had heated up this hot water that is meant like for after the Mila so that the baby is safe. And then it spills. We have no hot water. The implication being that if we don't have any hot water, we can't circumcise the baby because it won't be safe. Amar lehu Rabba. Naitule chamime migo bete. All right, Rabba says, let's bring warm water from my house. There's hot water there, apparently, just lying around. He's got a kumkum. Amrle Abaye, behalo arvinan. Abaye says, but we didn't do an eruv in the courtyard, so it would be carrying. We can't carry that water from your house. Amarle, mismocha shituf. Amarle, halo shashfinan. Rabba says, let's rely on this shituf, which is this way of sort of merging different alleyways together, which can also take the place of an eruv chatzerot. But Abaye is like, we also didn't do a shituf, so that's still a problem. Nemrule legoy leitile. So Rabba's like, okay, so let's tell a non-Jew to bring them. That should be fine. And then Abaye has this thing that is not the main chunk of our focus, but fascinating just approach-wise, where Amar Abaye, Baye lo tvelamar velo shav kan Rab Yosef. The Amar Rab Yosef Amar Rab Kana, ki avinan be Rab Yehuda, have Amar lan bita oraita motzvinan tiyufta v'hadar avdinan maaseh. B'derabanan avdinan maaseh v'hadar motzvinan tiyufta. Abaye is like, I had another objection to raise to Rabba, but Rav Yosef wouldn't let me give it, because he states this teaching that with a doraita matter that's about to be acted upon that you think is potentially doraita usser, you should raise your objection before it is done, right? Like if you think there's a problem, you should immediately raise that problem. If it's at most dirabanan isser that you have an objection to that you think might not be okay, that can wait until after it's done, right? It doesn't need to be brought up now. So this, again, almost everybody agrees that like Amira Lenochri, that telling a non-Jew to do something is at most a dirabanan isser. And so regardless of what they're doing. So he says, okay, I waited. The Batar Hachi Amar Le, my bite floats Velamar. So afterwards, Rav Yosef is like, well, what were you going to say to him? Amar Le, Titania, Haza Ashfut, V'Amira Legoy Shfut. Ma Haza Ashfut, Ve'ena Dochet Shabbat, Afimar Legoy Shfut, Ve'ena Dochet Shabbat. He says, well, we have a Baraita that talks about how the sprinkling of the water to metaher, to purify a person, is a shvut, and we don't allow it on Shabbos, even though, like, even for the purpose of a mitzvah, to be clear, right? To metaher, for example, somebody who wants to offer the korban pesach, we don't allow we don't allow the haza'ah. And so it's clearly not that we just in general say, oh, shvutz bimkom mitzvah is fine, right? We don't just say, oh, if something is only durabanan, if it's for the purpose of a mitzvah, it's okay. Even for the purpose of a mitzvah, you're not allowed to do haza'ah. So Amir al-Nochari is also a shvut. Why would we allow that? So Rav Yosef responds, Amar le, v'lo shani lach ben shvut yitz be'maseh l'shvut deletz be'maseh. Do you not distinguish between a shvut that sort of has an action versus one that does not have an action? And then the controversial line, Dahamar lo amar legoy zil achim. For the master did not say to the non-Jew, go heat up the water. So I said controversial line. We will see that whether or not this is a case where girsa differences, in fact, have a pretty massive impact on halacha. So with that in mind, basically, we will see that there are some girsaot that have the line I just stated about heating the water, and there are some that don't. Most of the sources will see explicitly what their girsaot are, but if they don't give it, we can usually infer. So we want to take a look first. We have the Sefer Hilchot Gedolot, right, the Bahag, Gaonic work, who sort of starts the ball rolling on how we paskin from this. So Max, do you want to read the bit in the larger text in the Sefer Hilchot Gedolot?
Yes, let me get there. Yeah. Okay. Okay. V'heicha de aiti izmal me'erev Shabbat v'ifgam o de ignav mekame mila shari lememar legoy letzavute o le'etuye izmal acharina degamrinan la
And then
be'erevim.
that's our whole bit that we just quoted.
Yeah. Okay, so in a case where they've brought a knife on Erev Shabbos and it got damaged or stolen before the meal took place, it's permitted to tell a goy to this is to sharpen savute, or to just bring a different knife based on our sugya.
What level Istorim are those?
Those are taken to be deoraita.
Right, like there are ways, especially the bringing, that like, yes, if you have a carnally, that it could be durabanan, but like, he gives no caveats, right? So seemingly we're saying, like, and also presumably that if it was pagum and you sharpen it, that is like mataka and mana. So I think that's pretty clearly a case of the deoraita iser. And he says, yeah, like you can tell an anju to do those. Just read for me in the bold, what's the end of the sugya that he quotes for us?
Velo shani lach bein shvuti b'maisa l'shvuta le b'maisa. There's no difference between a shvut that has.
Or do you not distinguish between?
Sorry, yes, in the right, because it's the question. Right, do you not distinguish between a shvut that has some sort of action, some sort of maisa or not?
So if we don't have the last line, right, the zil achim, what's the implication of Rav Yosef's retort?
There's no distinction between for Rav Yosef's retort, you said.
Right, Rav Yosef, who's defending the ability to like tell a non-Jew to do this thing, right? And Abaye was like, oh, we can't do the shvut of haza'ah, why can we do the shvut of amir al-nochri?
Right, so he's seemingly saying, I only permitted a derabana, not a deraita.
They're both derabanans, right? Rav Yosef agrees that, for example, haza'ah would be forbidden to do on Shabbos. He's implying what Mim.
Oh, sorry. I think you wouldn't even need to say like a weird circumlocution Amir al-Akhri thing. I think you could like, I think without the Lo Amar Zil Achim bit, you could Amar Zil Achim, and that would still be Lo Maisa, and that could still, and you'd still have an opinion that would be fine.
Right. It seems like without that final line, it seems like the most pshat read of Rav Yosef's statement is that Haza'ah is a shvut de'it masa. It's a derabanan where you are physically doing something. You're doing some sprinkling. Whereas Amir al-Nochri late masa, you're just telling a non-Jew to do something, right? That actually, like, sure, they're both technically derabanans, but maybe the latter is less problematic, right? Regardless of, as Mim just said, regardless of what you're telling them to do, maybe the fact that it's only a speech act and not a physical one makes it inherently less problematic than actually physically doing a derabanan iser, right? And so if that's where your girsa ends, it's very intuitive to end up where the Bahag does, which is seemingly to say, at least for Mila, yeah, you can tell a non-Jew to do any malacha for the purpose of Mila at the very least, right? Also, we didn't read this inside because it's in fact very short, but the bit in Gitin, the biggest exception that we'll see in addition to Mila is we see a permission. Initially, they say you can write a shtar to acquire land in Eretz Yisrael on Shabbat. And then they're like, you don't really mean you could write a shtar, like you yourself, like that's nuts. And so they're like, no, you can tell a non-Jew to write a shtar to acquire land in Eretz Yisrael on Shabbat or in Syria. Mishum Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, that on account of that mitzvah of settling the land, you are allowed to ask a non-Jew to do what is certainly a doraita iser, right? Everyone agrees on that. The question will be, how paradigmatic are these cases? So we move now into the Rif, and we'll see the Rif is strongly disagrees with what we just saw in the Bahag. So the first part that's in smaller text is just him quoting the Gemara. We pick up with, well, what does his girsa end with? I did bold it just for convenience's sake.
He does have Achim later, right?
Exactly. So the Rif does have this line that ends up in our Gemara as well. So Alan, do you want to pick up with Dehuma, so this is the Rif now inserting his own
Sure.
word.
Right, so there it's explaining us the last line to him, master that's correct. Dio activate the late day master that the time the word the almond. Okay. Like bringing, telling the guy to heat it up with it's something that's sister great, right? But just saying, bring it to me. There's not like a physical act. It's just speech. Vishatek,
Right, that we don't see, Abaye doesn't respond to this.
Right.
He doesn't defend himself. Right. Okay.
So Eninan behöver Ashkefan the lab really the something. And sorry, the reintroduction to this and we thought that these words and I didn't word it, but I did make it to this rest.
I can't hear you super well. Can other folks? Oh.
Any better? Yeah, I did not get to this rip, so if anyone
That
else
was
wants to jump in, it's fine.
Ori, do you want to give it a try?
Are we in the underlying part?
We're right a bit before, a couple lines above that. Ayaninan behu above the bold. Ayaninan behu eshkachan delav milay destam chaninu.
I don't see it.
This is, to be clear, I think it's a bit ambiguous. This is I think the Rif, he's gonna later mention him explicitly, but he's here, as you'll see from the psak he's about to quote, he's saying that the Bahag, that his words or interpretation are lav milay samcha, because he's now about to explain what would be the inference from our sugya as we have it. Do you see the bold? Umigufa dahai uvda.
Yeah. Umigufa dahai uvda yufat the asur lememar lenochri letzavute olatuye derech I don't know what that Rosh Tevot is.
Rishut harabim.
Rishut harabim.
Right. That.
Right.
First
So
of
I
all,
had this question too, actually.
So again, the bit before him was explaining the way we would say, the way that seemingly the Bahag would explain his girsa, which is, as we just said, Haza'ah is an action, Amir al-Nochri is just Dibora Ba'alma, and so that's why it's fine. And the Rif is like, no, I actually think that's not the pshat of what we have here. Our incident, as we have it, would seem to imply that you cannot tell them to either sharpen the knife, which again would be like mataken mana in Isser D'Oraita, or to carry it Reshut Harabim, which would also be in Isser D'Oraita. Why? Midzaka Amarle.
The Hamar, lo Amarle zil achim li, because he said, as long as you don't say, go warm it up for me, which makes it sound like we're talking about, like that would be the active, the direct command to an Isser D'Oraita to warm up the water. What I didn't totally understand here, though, is just to clarify in the Gemara, but we were saying that he could we are telling him to go get it, isn't that already carrying?
We are telling him to go get it, but he's seemingly carrying it between houses in a courtyard, which is only a Durabanan Isser. Remember that they're in a courtyard, and they're like, oh, we didn't do an Erevei Chatzerot, but that's not Derech Reshut Harabim.
Okay, we're sort of in between. That's what I didn't understand earlier in the Gemara. Okay. Mikladi asur lememar lenochri zil achim li. So we see that you can't go tell him to go warm it up for me. The kamami rabu uta ta'u bahai perusha. And some of my teachers, some of our other Rishonim made a mistake here on this explanation. Dahai memra the kasavri dahai the amarle lo shani velo shani le lemar ben shvuti it be maaseh le shvuto lech be maaseh. Because they explained that when you say, get this, the high, the amar lo shani le the mar ben shvut either, when they made a chiluk between a shvut that has an action and a shvut that doesn't have an action, a shvut haza'ak amar le, the shvut haza'ah shvut the itre masa. So haza'ah is supposed to be our example of a shvut that has, you're doing the action yourself. The shvut amir let be masa bi'adayim the dibura ba'amahu, right? So they were sort of staking their explanation and the difference between haza'ah as an active shvut and dibur to the goy as a passive one. But he doesn't agree with that. For him, the dibur would be just as much of an action potentially.
Exactly. We're not gonna, the riff here is lengthily explains why he understands that there's girsa differences. For one, he's aware that some of them don't have this phrase. He thinks that that's the incorrect girsa, right? He thinks his girsa, which has the zil achimli, is the correct one to have. One problem, admittedly, with the zil achimli, if the way we're understanding Rav Yosef's statement is that you can tell a non-Jew to do something that's usher d'Rabbanan, but you can't tell them to do something that's usher d'Oraita, what would you expect Rav Yosef to have said? Rav Joel, was that a him?
Yeah, I think he would have done what the Reef did, which is he would have said, I didn't ask him to bring it via Rishut Rabim. I think he would have done that as opposed to saying, well, you know, I didn't say go heat it for me, because then it would have been clear what the distinction was at that point.
Right. Like the achimli is, first of all, a weird comparison as opposed to, well, he's only bringing it vis-a-vis the mavoy, vis-a-vis the courtyard. Slash also the eats be'maseh versus leitz be'maseh is a weird way to phrase the difference between telling them to do a d'Rabbanan versus telling them to do a d'Oraita. The language of maaseh is weird, right? Like, don't you distinguish, like it could have said, don't you distinguish between a shvut and a shvut to shvut, right? That would have been a much clearer way of articulating that principle. So on the one hand, we do end up with, if I recall correctly, I think the way most people assume that the zil achimli actually is the more quote unquote correct girsa, because often if you have different girsaot, I know a general principle in academic Talmud is that whatever one makes less sense is usually the one that is more original, because people rarely correct manuscripts to make them make less sense. So it is in fact, I think, quite possible that the zil achimli was in there and was removed due to being an unintuitive inclusion. But we have it, and it's the one that we have in our Gemara today. And so the Rif ends up with this psak where he says, you cannot tell them to do a d'Oraita, you can tell them to do a d'Rabbanan. Right? Based off of the zil achimli, that's the conclusion the Rif arrives at. So with that, I think maybe we will pause and pick back up with the Tosfot when we resume in 5 minutes. May. So this one ends up a bit differently. We have a baby who, again, seemingly has not yet been circumcised, right? This is important because we say, we do need hot water to circumcise the baby. Maybe we ask the mother, do you perhaps need some hot water? And if she says she needs some hot water, we can ask a goy to heat up water for her and then use some of that for the baby. Now, an important element of this is that in general, a woman like post-birth is considered to be in some measure of sakana. For the first couple days, we say that even if she tells you she doesn't need something, you, a Jew, can violate Shabbos to do it for her. For the next few days, up until the end of 7 days, you, a Jew, can violate Shabbos for her if she says that she needs it. And then afterwards, until 30 days, I believe it is, it's that you cannot, a Jew cannot violate something for her, but a goy can, potentially, depending on what level of sakana there is. The implication seemingly here is that we need his considered ill mother as a reason for the goy to be able to heat the water, right? Seemingly the implication is that the baby itself, the ability to do the milah for the baby, is not sufficient reason to be able to tell the non-Jew to go heat the water, right? Which this actually, I believe, okay, this gets into the question of whether the Zil Achim Le was added or not. I believe there are some people who think that this line, which comes a bit later, inspired the addition of the Lo Amar Le Zil Achim Le, because we see later the question of not having a non-Jew heat up water for just the baby themselves, even though it makes less sense in the context of our original sugya. Okay, so we have this, and now we have the Tosfot, who are going to have ultimately our sort of most restrictive opinion. So this is them commenting on the bit in Gitin where we say that you can tell a non-Jew to write up the contract for you to buy land in Eretz Israel, Mishum Yishuv Eretz Israel. So Mim, do you want to read Aval Mishum in the Tosfot? Aval Mishum Mitzvah Acheret. You're on mute.
Sorry, my laptop is behaving like a laptop, or rather, it's behaving like a very broken laptop. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I just need to navigate on the bit of the screen that I can't see out of the situation that I've got myself into. Okay, yes. But aval mishum mitzvah acheret lo hayinu matirin. Amir lo matirin amir le'eved kochavim b'melacha d'oraita. But with other about any other mitzvah, you wouldn't be able to ask a goy to do it for you, to do melacha d'oraita for you about it. Ked b'chach b'perek chad erevin das samachet. Hahu ninuka de eshtepich chamima atila kamid rabba amar lehu l'shelu le'emei id tzricha nichemu lei agav imei ולכאורה משמע דביום המילה היה שהיו צריכים לחממו כדי למלוא, וקודם המילה היה דאי לאחר המילה דאי לאחר המילה מסוכן הוא, ובלא אין ממחל דין עליו בשבת.
Okay.
I think I got lost in the source here, but we're trying to make it a case where the only case in which you would be able to heat the water is the only case where anyone's happy with you heating the water is when there's a sakana thing, not when there's a mitzvah thing.
Right. So the Tosfot are trying to prove that the Mishum Yishuv Eretz Israel is the only mitzvah for which you can ask a non-Jew to do an Isser D'Oraita. That like in the case, he's quoting the bit that we just saw a little bit later in Eruvin, where the implication is that even though you need to do Mila for this baby, that wouldn't be sufficient reason to be able to tell a non-Jew to heat up the water, right? That it has to be by virtue of the mother. And they're saying pshat is that this is before the Mila, because if it's after, the baby would be like they would be in danger. If it's not, it's like potentially a level below bikuach nefesh, or they might not be about to be like immediately dying, but it's considered to endanger them, in which case we say you can ask a non-Jew to do anything, right? So this is seemingly in order to perform the Mila. We don't say that's sufficient reason, according to this Gemara, to tell a non-Jew to heat the water. So they're like, only time you can ask for an Isser D'Oraita is Mishum Yishuv Eretz Israel. They're going to make another important Girsa clarification here. Ba'al Yedei. Oh, you're muted again, Mim.
Nightmare, sorry. The al day of Oved Kochavim Ari Hatam Kada Perish Sham Bakuntros, the Kim Perish Rabbeinu Hananel, Kada Amrina Baperek Mifanin, the Haya Mashba'a Ad Shloshim Afilo Amra Tzvichani. אין מחלין עליה, et Shabbat. Oh, dachaya misheva. No, mashva'ah.
Mishiva from the
Yeah.
seventh day.
Okay. Okay. It's so if they survive into the sort of period between the 7th day and the 30th day, even if she says she needs it, then we're not machal Shabbat on her. But implicitly, maybe you can still get Goy to do it.
Exactly. That 7 to 30 days, you don't violate Shabbos for her, but you can get a non-Jew too. But they're saying there is an important distinction in which some people for this section don't have the word nachim le nochri agavime. There are some here that says nachim le agavime, implying that potentially there's a distinction as to, okay, yeah, if we're talking about just us heating it up, that like I, a Jew, can't like boil the water just in order for the mitzvah to be done. I can only do that in the case of like sakana for the mother. But yeah, so that's how some of the people who think Inusra D'Oraita is still allowed for Mila would reconcile it. But the Tosfot have a girsa that says Nochri, right? And so they say, this is good shot that only in the case of Mishum Yishuv Eretz Yisrael can you ask somebody to do, can you ask a non-Jew to do a mitzvah D'Oraita or an Isra D'Oraita? And then this last bit, they say, right? The other baby whose hot water spilled. Mishum mitzvat mila. Aval isura deoraita kagon lechamem lochamin asur. Ve'en lomod mekan heter lomar leoved kochavim levi sefer b'Shabbat derech karmelit delo dami dafka mishum mila v'hi gufa dachya Shabbat hitiru. So they're like, yes, in the case of mila, you were allowed to ask a non-Jew to do a derabanan level iser, which was carrying vis-a-vis a courtyard. But it's specifically with regard to Mila that even this is allowed because Mila has its own special status, right? That the Mila itself is Doche Shabbos, right? And so Mila, which has this special status to begin with, also you can ask a non-Jew to do an Isser D'Rabbanan for it. But the Tosfot are incredibly, they really limit this. They're like, okay, asking a non-Jew to do an Isser D'Oraita, that's only for Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. Asking a non-Jew to even do an Isser D'Rabbanan is only for Mila. For any other mitzvah, you can't ask a non-Jew even to do an Isser D'Rabbanan, right? You can't even ask for someone to like bring a Sefer or a Sefer Torah vis-a-vis a Carmelite, right? So asking them to do a D'Rabbanan. They say, no, you can't learn out other examples from Mila. It's Isser D'Oraita for Eretz Yisrael, Isser D'Rabbanan for Mila, no other things you can ask them to do for any other mitzvot. So the Tosfot end up having the most restrictive approach. Now we'll see the Rambam, who has a more expansive one. Josie, do you want to read the Rambam, Halacha Tet? You're on mute.
Yes, sure. I just had to get my papers ready and everything ready here. So, all right. So Halacha Tet, Davar she'le malacha ve'en isur la'asoto v'Shabbat, ele mishum shvut, mutar li'Yisrael lomar legoy la'asoto v'Shabbat. V'hu shehiyeh sham mitzat choli o yiyeh tzarich ledavar tzorech harbeh, o mipnei mitzvah. So the Rambam gives us basically 3 different ways we can ask a non-Jew to do us a shvut. And that is basically if there's somebody who's ill, or there's a great need, or there's a purpose for a mitzvah. So one of those 3 conditions he requires us to have in order to be able to ask a non-Jew to violate a shvut.
Right, and we'll see again, this is like miktzat choli, which is to distinguish from like, if it's pikuach nefesh, again, you yourself can do anything to help them. If it's sakana, then you can ask a non-Jew to do anything. But if it's like miktzat choli, or some other significant sorech, or a mitzvah, the Rambam thinks you can ask a non-Jew to do any mitzvah d'Rabbanan, right? But seemingly not any mitzvah or Isser D'Oraita. And so then skip down one line to Omer Abraham, the Ravid.
So just דבר שאין המלאכה ואין אסור לעשות בשבת כולי, הוא שיהיה שם מקצת חולי. אין אומרים אם היה מקצת חולי, הוא עצמו עושה שהרי גנוח יונק חלב בשבת.
Goneach yonek chalav b'Shabbat. That someone who is
Aleph,
willing
be clear, Aleph is not Ein Omrim.
this is Omer Avraham or Omer Ani, like this is the Ravid's indication that he's adding his words.
Okay. So Omer Avraham, im haya מקצה חולי, או עצמו עושה שהרי גונח יונק חלב בשבת.
Goneach yonek chalav b'Shabbat. Right, that a groaning person who's groaning because of their sickness can do what?
So I'm not quite sure. So I totally lost
They
my train.
can suck from a cow's teat on Shabbos if they need to, which is, if I recall correctly, it's like a shinoi in that it's not considered the normal form of mifarek, but is still part of mifarek, right? So the Ravid is saying, for miktzat choli, right, depending on how you're defining that, even you yourself can do certain, like, can violate certain shvutim, right? You don't need to tell a non-Jew to do it, right? V'chein
amru, halacha machzirin et hashever, v'chein amru, b'makom hefsed kegon tzinor she'alu bo kashkashin memachan b'raglav. Which I have to admit I did not follow completely.
So the Ravid's giving a couple examples of cases where you yourself are even allowed to do a shvutz, right? That both you can restore a break, and also that in a case of significant hefsed, like there's weeds that are blocking up your drainage pipe, you can like stomp around them, right? So the Ravid is adding in, he's like, actually in some of these cases, the Rambam mentioned, even the person themselves can do a shvutz, right? Like kol shekain that you could ask a non-Jew to do a shvut, but that's maybe not even necessary in some of these. Okay. The next
So
bit, the halacha yud.
So he's being more Mako overall then.
Huh?
In this case. He's being
Yes.
more Mako than the Rambam is in this case.
Right. He's seemingly expanding the Rambam's heter. And the Rambam, as we see, is certainly more expansive than the Tosfot, right? The Tosfot think you can only even ask a non-Jew to do an Isser D'Rabanan for Mila, right? Not for any other mitzvah, right? Whereas the Rambam thinks you can ask them to do an Isser D'Rabanan for any kind of mitzvah or significant sorech. He gives the example of like asking them to climb up a tree to get a shofar or things like that. That's a shvutz for the purpose of the mitzvah. And then the Yod Aleph, he mentions that the specific case of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, you can even ask them to do Isser D'Oraita. Okay, the Etor, we're not going to read all inside. Can anyone tell me what is the Etor's stance? He is a Date Yachid seemingly, or maybe in line with the Bahag, but what is the Etor's stance? I too hate it when my shofar is stuck in a tree. What does the Etor think you can ask a non-Jew to do?
Anything for the Tzorach mitzvah, it sounds like.
If it's for Torah mitzvah, you can ask them to do anything. Any Isser D'Oraita for any Tzorach mitzvah, fine. Right? This is potentially in line with the Bahag that we saw earlier. He minimally thinks that you can ask them to do an Isser D'Oraita for Mila. It's not totally clear whether he thinks that extends to other mitzvot or not. Whereas the Etor explicitly extends that and says, yeah, this applies to all of these cases. Any case of a mitzvah, you can ask a non-Jew to do anything, even if it's an Isser D'Oraita. We see that for the most part, that is not an opinion that most people end up following, but it is sort of kept in people's back pockets when we want to be more Mako. Okay, I think we're not going to look at the Rashba side because he doesn't have a super unique chiddush. I'm going to read the Ran here. Adds on a little bit. If people see the bit that's under the underlined bit at the top of the 5th page. ונמצא פסקן של דברים. לפי שיטה זו, שמתירים אמירה לנוכרי אפילו במלאכה גמורה לגבי מכשירי מילה, ואם באנו להשוות שאר מצוות למכשירי מילה, כדרך שהשווה אותם הרמב"ם, לפי שיטתו, וכמו שנכתוב בסמוך בסייעתא דשמיא, אף בכל המצוות נתיר אמירה לנוכרי אפילו במלאכה גמורה. נראה שזהו דעת הרב בעל העיטור, שהתיר לומר לנוכרי להדליק לו את הנר לסעודת שבת. Right, so the Ran points out that there's sort of a couple different axes going on here, right? One is what level of Isser do we think was allowed for Mila, for example? And another is how much are we allowed to extrapolate from the Mila case, right? Are we allowed to learn out from that to other cases of mitzvot? Or is it meant to actually be a sort of sui generis scenario, right? So the Ran is pointing out that if you think that in the Mila case, the person is allowed to do a Doraita, then if you have the Rambam's approach that Mila is meant to be extrapolated to other mitzvot, you end up with the Baal HaItor's approach, right? That anything Doraita can be done. Aval datar Rav Alfasi eno kain, shehu sover delo shari amira lenochri b'machshirei Mila, ela b'devar she'afilu al yedei Yisrael, eno ela mishum shvut, v'kamo shekatuv b'hochotav, v'chein dat Rambam, hitir shvut to shvut, dainu amira lenochri b'devar shehu mishum shvut, k'machshirei Lula b'shofar. Aval Haramban Zal, right? This is the Ramban's about to articulate essentially the Tosfot position. So vered v'kahai gavna nami lo share ela b'mila bilvad lefi shenitna Shabbat litchot etzla. Aval b'shar mitzvot ein dochin shvut klal k'dash kachan delo dachinan shvut shvut bimkom pseida. V'zohi shaninu nochri Shabbat lichvot ein omrim lo kaveh ve'al tichpeh. Yaval gav dehave shvut demalacha she'ena tzricha legufa. This is a smart chiddush of the Ramban, right? The Ramban ends up with the same position of the Tosfot, right? Which is that he says, you can't ask a non-Jew to even do a shvut, to even do a derabanan iser for anything besides Mila. And his proof for that is that we have this case of if your home is on fire and a nocher comes, you don't have to stop them from putting it out, but you're not allowed to tell them to put it out. And we established elsewhere that kibui, that extinguishing, the only form of kibui for which you are chayav d'oraita is if you are doing it to create a pacham, so like a coal or a wick, because that's the only productive kibui, right? Kibui that's just meant to extinguish is malacha she'ena tzricha legufa, like kibui not for its normal productive purpose. And so that, if you hold, like Rabbi Shimon, is only asur d'rabanan. And we still say you're not allowed to tell the non-Jew to put it out. Right, so this is the Ramban's like gotcha that even for a case of big loss, you're not allowed to tell a non-Jew to do something that's even asur d'rabanan. One potential way that you could resolve that is saying that Mishnah is in accordance with Rabbi Yehuda, right, who thinks that malacha she'en tzricha legufa is asur d'oraita, but it's a smart proof nonetheless. Okay, we are going to look a little, not at all of, but a little bit of the Beit Yosef. So Beit Yosef in our Siman, within Sif Katan K. Okay. We get I want us to look, the first part of it is him largely summarizing what we've just seen inside, but I want him to see us to see also what he brings from the Rav Yah. So for people who have the Shirat Devora in front of them, this is sort of the next like big koteret in Hey is Vikatuv Od Sham B'Shem Rav Yah. Give me a thumbs up if you see that. Aaron, do you want to read?
Sure. וכתוב עוד שם בשם רביה, דאמיר לגוי בדאורייתא נמי לא אסירה אלא בדבר שאי אפשר למצוא תקנה על ידי ישראל לעשותו, כגון לחמם חמין. אבל אם אפשר לעשותו, כגון ברשות הרבים, דיכול להביא על ידי מחיצות בני אדם, שרי אמיר לגוי. והיכא דאיכא למימר, דיל מעטה לאכלופי ברשות הרבים, אסור אמיר לגוי. אפילו באיסור דרבנן, ואפילו דבר מצווה, כדאמרינן גבי ינוקה דאישתפו חמימי. עד כאן לשנה. So the Ravia says, Even with an Isser D'Oraita, Amir Lagoy is only forbidden with something that a Jew, there's no conceivable way a Jew could have done it on Shabbat, like heating up hot water. But if there is something, right, carrying is fine because if a Jew had set up an Eruv or lived inside an Eruv, it would be fine to be carrying. So that is not a problem. But
Well,
if
not even an Eruv. You could literally
or mechitza.
yeah, it's that actually it's something you could do on Shabbos, right? Because like
Right.
you could have set up an Eruv is a bit too far. It's like you could make people come line up and stand and create a human mechitza. And so theoretically, if you gathered enough of a crowd, you could have found a way to get this yourself. So you can ask them to bring it.
Except in the case, right, if you think it's going to lead to confusion about where Rishut Rabim or what Rishut Rabim is, then you can't do a Miram, even for an Isser D'Rabbanan. But in general, the Rav Yah's principle is, right, only things for which there's no takana for a Jew to do on Shabbat are forbidden.
Right.
והד ההתיר בדבר שאפשר למצוא תקנה על ידי ישראל לעשותו וכולי, אפשר להתיר אלא לדבר מצווה דווקא, אבל שלא לדבר מצווה לא. So the Beit Yosef has come in with a frum interpolation that it must be specifically for, it's possible, or seems, that it's specifically for Devar Mitzvah. You can't ask a non-Jew to carry so that you can have your stuff ready for Motzash, or so that you could, you really want to play Magic the Gathering and you left your cards outside outside there.
Because you could have created a mechitza of people. Well, the last bit is just him saying that the bit about lo atzilei chufik or shdi rabim is a bit confusing. It seems to sort of contradict himself, but the main thing here, right, the Rav Yah has added another additional axis, right, that maybe in general you can't ask them to do Isurei Doraita, but if it's something that like you technically could have done yourself and the non-Jewish are sort of making it much more convenient, but you theoretically could have found a way to accomplish it for yourself in a mutter way, then you're allowed to ask them to do it, which again, not totally clear whether the Rav Yah did in fact mean to limit that to mitzvot or not, but the Beit Yosef is like, clearly, he is not saying you could ask them to bring your code names to you on Shabbos without the errors. Okay. Now we're going to flip forward to the Shulchan Aruch. We will see that he paskins pretty straightforwardly. When you're there, Jacob, do you want to read Hey in the Shulchan Aruch?
Devar she'eno malacha ve'eno asor lasoto b'shvat el mishum shvut mutar li'Yisrael lomar le'eno Yehudi lasoto b'shvat. So if it's not malacha and it's only prohibited on Shabbat because of shvut, you can say to a non-Jew to do it on Shabbat. V'hu sheya sham mikzat choli. Oh yeah, sarach lidavar sarach harbe omipnei mitzvah. This is only when there's someone who's sick, or there's a really big need, or because of a mitzvah. Ketzad. Omer Yisrael inu Yehudi b'shvat lalot b'ilan lavi shofar l'koat kia mitzvah. Ola v'mayim derech hatzer shel irvu l'chotz bo hamitzdayer. V'yesh oserim.
Okay.
Yeah.
Actually, sorry, read the quick Ramah, Ulakaman.
Ulakaman Siman Taf Kuf Pevav Pasak La'atir. The Ayin La'ayel Siman Reish Ayin Vav Sif Bet Dish Makilin Afilu Malacha D'Oraita. The Ayin Sham Sif Gimel. So later, he'll give the Mechaber will give the Psak to permit it, and he even says that in another Siman and Sif that there are those who are lenient even with Malacha D'Oraita.
Right. So who does the Mechaber Paskin like?
I'm bad at keeping track of which are which.
Open question, Max.
Like the Rambam.
Yeah, he straightforward, word for word copies a lot of what the Rambam
But
says.
but he doesn't mention Mila
Right.
specifically, which is
It's
interesting.
true. Yeah, it's interesting given that he largely in a lot of ways fully copies the Rambam's language, but then adds a couple sort of and subtracts a few things. It's something that the Magen Avraham adds, right? And this sort of gets to the Ravid's critique, is that we have a lot of different sort of madrigot in sickness, right? Again, there's pikuach nefesh, they're about to die. Anyone can do anything for them, right? There's misukan, which is they might not be about to die, but they are actually something is seriously impacting their long-term health, in which case a non-Jew can be asked to do anything for them. Then there's mitzta'er, right? Which is your long-term health is going to be fine, but you're really suffering in an incapacitating way, right? It's not necessarily going to threaten or shorten your lifespan or whatever, but you have a debilitating migraine, right? And you can't leave your bed. And then there's seemingly the miktsat holi is the lowest madriga of yeah, I've got a cold, I could be up and about, I could do things. I'm just not feeling amazing. And saying that even in that case, you could ask a non-Jew to do a shvut for you, is the implication of this psak. Okay. Questions before or comments, thoughts, dilemmas before we move on a little into some of the other theme that engage with this. Rav Joel, it looks like you.
I want to know if we could talk about the Magen Avraham a little bit here. I don't know. You can tell me no. But
I don't know if we have time. I essentially, because I think it is fascinating and valuable, I don't think we have time to go through the entirety of it in depth. But is there a bit that in particular you would like to?
I mean, just let's see, where was it? It's 3 lines in Sif Katan Zayin, where it says V'da she'im medamnim davar ledvar b'inyanei hashvutim. That's kind of his bottom line there, is right. He's actually don't make any blanket rules about shvut, and Amira Lagoy. Just if it says somewhere in Chazal you can do it, then you can do it. If it doesn't say somewhere in Chazal you can do it, then you can't do it, and that's it. It's just a list, and there's no concept essentially.
Right. The Magen Avraham, he ends up paskening in a more formatic way than the Shulchan Aruch seems to. But there's an interesting thing where he actually sort of responds to the Ramban's issue about the don't tell the Nochri Tifbeh or Al Tifbeh, right? Which the Ramban used to prove that even in a case of Hefsed Gadol, you can't tell a non-Jew to do even an Isser D'Rabbanan. And he was okay, but since Kibui itself, when it is Tzricha Lagufa, is an Isser D'Oraita, maybe specifically with something like that, where it actually is a malacha act, and they're just technically doing it in a Tzricha Lagufa way, we're worried that people would get mixed up and think that you can tell a non-Jew to do an actual Isser D'Oraita to save money. But maybe other shvutim, where we're not worried about them getting that mixed up, you could in fact tell them to do it in a case of Hefsed Gadol, right? And so he's a bit wary about it in a way that the Mechaber isn't, right? The Mechaber just says yeah, it's a case of Hefsed, you can tell them to do a shvut. And he's kind of well, maybe we can arrive at the conclusion if it's really going to be a big loss, then potentially it's allowed. Ori?
I think that's an interesting place to compare the Tosfot also, because I do think there's a desire here to make a principle, and the Tosfot also are basically resistant to the principle. The case of Mila is specific to Mila, the case of Eretz Yisrael is specific to buying in Eretz Yisrael, and because it's so complicated, all the different examples, and you can't put on a chart when you have this many compound concerns, whether it's the different levels of sakana, pikuach nefesh, or mitztayer, or a shvut versus doraita. Don't forget, we sort of left behind the idea of yesh bo maaseh, which that was in the first Gemara, right? Or is that part of the line that might be girsa dependent?
So everyone has language of yesh bo maaseh or ein bo
Right.
maaseh. But again, the problem is that people really, I've only seen the interpretation of that go two ways, again, depending on whether they have the Zil Achim line afterwards. If they don't have the Zil Achim line, they're like, yeah, shot of this language here is that Amira itself telling to do anything is a shvut ein bo maaseh because you're just speaking. And things like haza'ah, where you're doing the act yourself, is a shvut d'it be maaseh. But once you add the Zil Achim, most people just read it as the difference between a Doraita versus a Durabanan.
Right. But I think with all of those compounding concerns, it is very hard you wouldn't really be able to make a chart that has the principle completely outlined. So that could prompt the Tosfot or the Magen Avraham to say, stick to the very specific instances that we have in Chazal, certainly in the Gemara. For Tosfot, it's really what's in the Gemara that you're sticking to. But the Rambam, which I think is, makes sense for the Rambam, is like sees a principle here.
Right. The Rambam likes to extrapolate. And yeah, like it is a really interesting question. And the line that like Rav Joel highlighted in the Magen Avraham, the question of like, yeah, how willing are we to extend this and see this as a paradigm versus to say, this is the case they were talking about. It was not meant to be something that you learned out to every other case. Some mitzvot have unique properties, right? Maybe this applies to Mila. That doesn't actually mean it automatically applies to every other thing. If they wanted to say that, they'd have said that. As opposed to the Rambam being like, no, if they wanted to say it was only Mila, they would have said that, right? They never made that distinction, implying potentially that like, yeah, we can spin this out a little. I do want us to continue reading just because there are some more fascinating sources here. The Shulchan Aruch that I put on the doc in Rish Ayin Vav, the Ramah here has a fascinating bit of documentation about things people did. Sarah, do you want to read the Yesh Omrim?
Hold on one second. Okay. Yesh omrim demutar lumar la'akum lahadlik lo ner lesudat Shabbat mishum desvira le demutar amira la'akum afilu b'melacha gmura b'makom mitzvah. Run, etc. She'al pi ze nahagu rabim lahakel badavar litzvot la'akum lahadlik nerot tzorech tzuda bifrat b'tzudat chatuna o mila ve'ein moche bi'adam. ויש להחמיר במקום שאין צורך גדול, הרוב הפוסקים חולקים על סברה זו, בעיין לקמן סימן שין זין, ספר תרומה, etc. That's fascinating. Right, okay, so there are some people who say that you can do Amirala Akum to ask them to essentially like light a little light for your Shabbos meal, because that is L'tzorech mitzvah. But it's also the case that probably you shouldn't, in general, rely on this far because it's very contested. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like this is the example that the Itor gave when he was like, yeah, maybe we can totally generalize to any, Isser D'Oraita. Maybe you can ask the non-Jew to light your Shabbos candle. And the Itor is just like spitballing here and like is the only person who says that. But it's something that apparently felt important enough or intuitive enough that like people are practicing this way. And despite the fact that the Itor is like a dat yachid, the Ramah is like,
okay, gonna let it happen.
People are doing it. And since there is at least a dea that says it's okay, and especially since they're doing it for these like important events,
then it's all right.
Let it happen. But like in general, if it's just for your like normal Shabbos meal, maybe don't rely just on the Itor. But like you have a chatuna and there's no lighting, fine, maybe you can ask the non-Jew to light a candle, which actually leads us very neatly. We're gonna briefly skip the Mishnah Brura. Do you want to keep reading, Sarah, the Shin Lamed Chet?
Yeah, okay. Yesh Matirin, is that where we are? Okay, Yesh Matirin lomar la'akum linagen v'kli shir v'chupat. Right, so he says you can ask a non-Jew to play music, on your at your Friday night wedding, presumably. V'afilo lomar la'akum l'takein kli shir. Share mishum kavod chatan v'kala. Okay, well, v'lav hachi asur. You can even ask them to fix your instruments. So that gets rid of the whole problem that you might come to fix your instrument. You just have a non-Jew there who can fix your instrument for you, for a wedding, but not in a general case. ומיהו בזמן הזה נהגו להקל, מטעם שיתבאר בסימן שאחר זה לעניין טיפוח וריקוד. Okay, and I'm gonna explain this in the next one.
So, okay, fascinating again, the Ramah just dropping some like really interesting tidbits about people's practices. So this is the Rav Ya, right? The Rav Ya says, yeah, you can ask a non-Jew to play music at your Shabbos wedding. And again, goes even further, like you can ask that, like they can fix the instrument, right? Like the Linagen Klishir, the actual playing itself is only a shvut, but like you can have them do an Isser D'Oraita of fixing this Kli so that there's music to Misamecha Tani Makala, right? So it's, and this is like clearly a Lamaisa thing that like they were doing, right? They were asking non-Jews to come play music at their Shabbos weddings. And the Ramah is like, okay, I get that that's happening, maybe just to Misamecha Tani Makala, but actually, a lot of people, I think the fact that he's saying people are doing this means he's saying people are like asking non-Jews to play music for them, not just on weddings. Like they're like, I would like a nice, relaxing piano tune while I have my Shabbos lunch. And that sense, we have certain reasons to be potentially more mekel about the like Rikud and Tipuach and things like that than we were back in the Gemara. Maybe we can allow people to ask non-Jews to do it. Like you're still not supposed to do it, but he's clearly reluctant, and nonetheless, it's like a practice that people are doing. People are just asking non-Jews to light the fires for their meals and to play music for them, and they're like, since we can find a way to justify it, maybe it's allowed. Yes, the Ramah, when it comes to the question of the Shabbos weddings themselves, this is also getting into the fact that like the Chachila, you're not really supposed to be having weddings on Shabbos, but we see that
It's a wedding reception. I think he means a wedding reception.
Well, quite possibly, but the Ramah does have the famous tshuva where he like allows, again, for the purpose of whoever. There's a whole thing about like
he did a wedding on Shabbat. Like he said, like
he did
particular case, right?
Yeah,
like,
he said in like this case, the girl's like an orphan or whatever, and if things get messed up,
and the guy is a flight risk. He's like, I'm not going to marry her. So then he says, well, okay, you're going to marry her now.
Yeah, the Ramah was not necessarily.
I think the custom was to get married on Friday afternoon, and then the wedding party was Saturday night. Was Friday night.
Yeah, so that you could use the same meal for both things because people were not rich. Okay. Now we have. I mostly did not include the Mishnah Berurah because Rav Joel can get into that in a few days. But Ori, do you want to read the Mishnah Berurah right above here, the Deha Rov V'chulei?
Sure.
This is on the Ramah we read before, where we say the majority of poskim say you should not tell a non-Jew to do an Isser D'Oraita for any mitzvah.
Okay, and I had a question about the status of the non-Jew, but I'll save it if we have time. Deharov v'chulei, ומכל מקום מותר לומר לאינו יהודי לתקן את העירוב שנתקלקל בשבת, כדי שלא יבואו רבים לידי מכשול. So in any event, we allow a non-Jew to fix an eruv that was messed up or broken on Shabbat, specifically so it won't cause many people to, commit a sin by, not knowing the eruv was down. And you can, in this case, it would be good to rely on the Baal Ha'itzer, to allow a shvut when it's in speaking, even in the D'Oraita, bimakom mitzvah derabim, right? So here's another like sort of you're combining the idea of mitzvah, but also a group, a large group, so it has more importance. Da'at ha Pri Megadim le'el b'sof samachuf kafbet. Sif katan kafbet.
So we add
Pri Megadim brings that also.
Exactly. We add in yet another factor, which is this notion of like, okay, maybe in general, the Bala Itor, not who we're relying on just for like day-to-day function, just for any mitzvah. But like something like the Eruv, where if it's not fixed, there will be actually tons of Jews maybe realistically maybe violating an Isser D'Rabbanans if you hold that most things today are Carmelites and not Rishut Rabbim, but maybe an Isser D'Rabbanan, maybe an Isser D'Oraita. In that case, to prevent a bunch of Jews from carrying on Shabbos, you can do this shvut of like asking a non-Jew to fix the Eruv, even though that will involve D'Oraita Isurim. Rav Joel?
This is a kind of a side note to this, but there is a little bit of a debate in the Achronim about whether or not if the Eruv is up when Shabbos comes in at Ben Mashmashot, whether or not it doesn't matter if it goes down. Here, the Mishnah Berurah has clearly picked a side that it does matter. So I just wanted to throw that out there. It's
Yeah, relevant point. And you can understand why some would want to say if it was up finish mashot, it's fixed, it's done, you can treat it as if it's there, so you don't have to worry about these sorts of things. Okay, I think we're not going to read Shin Kaf Hey inside. It's mostly he brings in the notion of like benefiting from the non-Jews' labor depending on whether they're doing it for you or not, and ends up saying that like if they do it for you but it's only an Isser D'Rabbanan and you didn't ask them to do it, then you can benefit from it. And then brings in that like in general people are also a bit makel about asking non-Jews then to do things like bringing them beer. You know, you want beer for your Shabbos lunch, maybe you can ask the non-Jew to carry it via the Carmelite. Maybe that's okay. You know, this is which so it's an interesting thing where like despite having the, for example, incredibly limiting positions like the Tosfot and the Ramban, we see that for the most part, like the Itor has surprising staying power for one, despite being like an individual dea. And in general, we still land on the more Mekel side of things, right? Like we're not lichatchila paskening across the board like the Itor, but in general, we incline towards like the opinion of the Rambam that like you can ask them to do a shvut for like a meaningful purpose, right? Maybe not to like play your Shabbos game, but like if it's for like a mitzvah or you're a little sick, or you might lose some money, all of those are like sufficient reasons to ask the non-Jew to do something. Okay. Did I just see a hand or
Yeah, I think I just want to mention it, and I know so this is all Amir Goy with no hiring involved, right? No monetary transfer.
Correct. This is just telling them to do something.
But it seems like some of the examples might implicate hiring relationships, like certainly playing at a wedding. It's hard to imagine you're asking a non-Jew to come play for free at a wedding.
I was thinking the same thing. Can you ask a non-Jew to buy you grape juice on Shabbos so you can make Kiddush?
Presumably the notion is that like I think arguably in these cases where you're allowed to ask them to buy something or to do something, presumably you're allowed to also say, I'll pay you after Shabbos. Like that's not seemingly more problematic than saying, do this thing. Like I would find it hard to imagine that you're allowed to ask them to do this Isser, but you're not allowed to do the dibor of like saying you'll pay them.
What about all the cases that we learned about, like for a dead person, you're not allowed to like asking them to get tachrichim. You're not supposed to do that. Does it all fit together is the question.
Also, the relationship with the non-Jew that they're imagining seems maybe different in different cases. Like there's the kind of classic Shabbos goy where you have this like relationship and understanding that I think is not paid. And I felt like I always assumed that was because to pay someone would make it more you doing it, more than Amirah, right? Like Amirah is sort of, in my mind, it was sort of lower because it's like, okay, I'm asking you for a favor. Would you do this? If I'm paying you, it's like I'm actionably the one making it happen was my assumption, but I just feel like that intersects with this in most of the real life cases also, you know, that we could imagine today would really be more, I think, paying than favors.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of this is like interesting when it gets to, I think you're right to bring in the question of how much this is or isn't implicated in the broader monetary relationships and like how much a lot of these dynamics vary. Of course, this also gets into the stuff when you're not even asking them to do it, where we saw that the question of like your relationship to the non-Jew is very relevant. because it determines sort of like when we assume they're doing things sort of for you or not, or that they might come to do things for you, which implies some level of relationship and familiarity. I do, in our last little bit, want us to look at the remaining Sifim. Okay, the bit here, the Mishnah that I brought is the one that we quoted earlier about your home's on fire, you don't have to tell the non-Jew not to put it out, but you can't tell them to put it out. And Rabbi Ami says, you can say anyone who puts it out won't lose out, which is the indirect way of saying, I could pay you after Shabbos if you put out this fire. Max, do you want to read the bit in Ketubot?
Sure. V'hada amar Rabbi Ami b'deleika hitiru lamar kol hamechabe ino mafsid b'deleika lemu'utei mai lemu'utei shar yisurim d'Shabbat. So when Rabbi Ami said this piece about kol hamechabe ino mafsid, when he says that it's for a fire, what is he excluding? And it's coming to exclude any other isurim on Shabbos.
Right. So there's at least one opinion that like this isn't something, this sort of remez, indirect, like anyone who puts this out won't lose out. At least one opinion says that's like specific to a fire, maybe not something you can extend to other cases of loss. So let's see, Max, do you want to continue with Vav in the Shulchan Aruch? Or sorry, not Vav in the Shulchan Aruch, with Kaf Yud Tet in the Shulchan Aruch. There we go.
Sure. Schora hanifseret b'Shabbat al yedei gshamim o davar acher, o i'ati b'dika, demaya u'mafsid mamono, o shnitro ha'ach chavit shel yain v'holech li'ibud, mutar likrot akum, afa pi shavadai yodea sha'akum yatzil hamamon. So if there's some other type of damage, a flood or something, or earthquake maybe, then you can.
The Maya is like if there's like a body of water that's gonna get to your stuff.
Overflowing. Yeah. Right. If something overflowing, then you can call for the non-Jew, even though you know that what the non-Jew is going to come do is save yourself.
Ulechasot schora.
Ulechasot schora o pirot o davar acher mipnei akshamim ayan lekaman siman shin lamed chay siv zayin. So about covering your stuff so that it doesn't get damaged from the rain. I'll deal with later. V'chein mutar lamar la'akum kol hamatzil eino mafsid kmo b'deleika shehitiru lomar kol hamechabe eino mafsid v'yish mi she'omer shelo hitiru ela b'deleika dafka. And it's mutter to ask a non-Jew or to say to a non-Jew, anyone who saves this won't lose out, just like we said with the fire, but there are others who say that this only is for the fire and nothing else.
Right. So the Mechaber ultimately paskins that this is like an extendable case, right? That the fire is relevant to like any case of significant loss, that you can use this, like you can call them to the area, or you can even call them to the area and say, if you put it out, or if you move this thing, whatever, you won't lose. And that applies to any case of loss. Some say only with the Deleka, but that's not how he's paskening. Okay. In our last few minutes, Kaf discusses the principle that we've already gotten into, but when we're actually talking about the Amirah, which is Yisrael she'amar le'eno Yehudi la'asot lo malacha b'Shabbat, mutar lo lehnot ba le'erev b'chdei she'asu. Right? If you do end up telling a non-Jew to do something for you on Shabbos, you can benefit from it, but only after Shabbos in the amount of time that it would take to do that action, aka you are not benefiting from them having done it on Shabbos. And the last bit we have Kuf Aleph, Asur lamar le'eno Yehudi b'Shabbat, Helach basar zeh, u'bashelot oto letzrecha, v'afilu ein mizonotav alav. I can't like give a non-Jew a slab of meat and be like, hey, make a rib for yourself. Aval mutar lamar lo lasot melacha latzmo. But if the non-Jew like came to my home, is hanging out and is like, I brought my own little grill and some ribs, can I smoke them here? You can be like, yeah, go for it. If it's for yourself, you're allowed to do that. And then finally, the Ramah in this last Seif, Kufbet, is gonna sort of expand on this notion of Remizah that we've seen. So, Kol Shvut D'Rabbanan Mutar Ben Ishmashot L'Tzorach Mitzvah. So any D'Rabbanan Isser, during Ben Ishmashot, you can do it for a purpose of a mitzvah. Kigon Lomar Le'eno Yehudi Lahadlik Lo Ner Ben Ishmashot. So everyone says if it's Ben Ishmashot as opposed to properly on Shabbos, you can ask the non-Jew to do it. Oh, Yim Hayat Harud V'Hutzrach La'aser Ben Ishmashot. Or like you need to tithe your produce. And then Haga, Kol Davar Asor Lomar Le'eno Yehudi La'asoto B'Shabbat. Asor, they're mos lo la'asoto, right? In general, then this is a huge divergence from how many people now practice the Shabbos goy element. You're not allowed to, like, a thing that it would be usher for them to do, for you to explicitly tell them to do, you're also not supposed to hint to them to do, right? Like, wow, it would be really nice if that thing was turned on. If it's not something you could explicitly tell them to do, he's saying it's usher even to hint. You can say, wow, it would be really nice if this thing was cooked after Shabbos ends, right? You can basically indirectly mention something you want them to do motzash, right? Where we saw earlier that you're not allowed to tell them, hey, cook this thing motzash, because you're not supposed to be talking about that on Shabbat. You can indirectly talk about them doing things after Shabbos. You're not allowed to hint towards anything you couldn't explicitly say. And then we have Eno Yehudim HaMevi'im Tfuah B'Shabbat L'Yisrael Chayvim Lahem V'Yisrael Noten Lo Miftacho Lo Etzro Eno Yehudim don't know L'Sham. So we have this whole thing about non-Jews paying chovim, right? Like paying debts with produce. Yesh Misha Matir Mishum De'eno Yehudi B'Melechet Atzmo Osek Ve'eno Shel Yisrael Ad Achar Medida Sheyichshov Imo Achar Kach. וכן אינם יהודים העושים גבינות בשבת וישראל רואה ויקנה אותם ממנו. אז מכל מקום האינו יהודי עדת את נפשי כעביד, ואף על פי שישראל עומד בעדר חודש או חודשיים, ועדת למוכרם לישראל כעביד שרי. You can even benefit from, this is a very specific example he's bringing, but the non-Jews who are making these cheeses on Shabbat, and you know, you're standing there looking at them making the cheeses, and they know you as a Jew want to buy those cheeses you're making on Shabbos. Since it is their general schora, and
why are you watching? Why are you watching?
I really don't have so much clarity on the situation.
I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. To make it not gvinat akum.
Right. Yeah.
In other words, you're actually
he's like,
participating. That's the Kiddush. You're actually participating in the creation of this milk and cheese, and to make it mutter.
Well, but no, you're not
doing a malacha. It's his business.
You're not participating in the cheese making, right? Like you've been watching him doing the milking, so you can.
I meant to say in a general sense, you're participating in this creation and enough so that it will be edible, but you're not participating in any way that's forbidden, and you didn't tell him to do it. You're just watching. It's like you're walking a very fine line here.
Indeed. All right. Well, shkoyach everybody. It was a fun rundown of Amir al-Nochri in Bimkom Mitzvah / Tzarech. And next week, Muktzah. Woo!
Thank you very much.
Muktzah.
Thank
you. Good night.
Shkoyach. Very nice. Very nice.
Very good. Very good.
You should have good relationships with our goyim.
Amen.
Amen.
It's easy to say.
Easy to say.
Yeah, the next Siman has like something like 54 seifim.
Right.
It's about and there's two more seifim that deal with muksa.
You have to decide.
You have to think about how much we're going to do and how. One of the books that I look at that has like summaries of shitot, just summaries of shitot,
right,
has 60 pages on the Siman.
Right.
Normally it has 8 pages on the Siman. So I don't know. Just to read 60 pages and to figure out what I'm interested in is already impossible. but I'm trying to find some stuff.
All right, this was very good tonight.
Yeah, it's very good. She's good. She's improved a lot from the past couple of years.
Yeah, she has.
It's a very clear share.
You're right. You are right. Okay.
Okay, Laila Tov.
Take care. Laila Tov.